we are talking about wetlands today, specifically forest wetlands. So welcome. I'm going to introduce Rachel Kendall, and then I'm going to let her take over for the presentation. So Rachel grew up in rural Nova Scotia and is interested in applying her knowledge to projects that support the sustainability of communities and industries in Nova Scotia. Rachel pursued a Bachelor of Science at St. Mary's University, where she had the opportunity to work on a large collaborative forested wetland project. She then pursued a Master of Science at McGill University, where she worked on a research project assessing the biochemical cycling in harvested peatlands in Quebec and Alberta. Rachel is currently working as a research associate with NSCC Applied Research. She gained professional recognition with her paper on the role of forested wetlands as carbon sinks in southwest Nova Scotia. This research showed that forested wetlands store more carbon in the soil than adjacent upland forests. This is important information to guide decision-making around wetlands, and this was also the first carbon budget study of forested wetlands in Nova Scotia. In this talk, Rachel will give a background on wetlands in Nova Scotia, how she did this research, and the results. She will also highlight studies conducted by other researchers as part of the large collaborative forested wetlands research in Atlantic Canada. So with that, Rachel, I'm going to let you take over, and you're already sharing your screen, so.
All right, thank you very much. And welcome everyone. Just a heads up, I have two screens on the go, so my head is kind of going back and forth a little bit. So thank you very much. Thank you to Jess from Nature Nova Scotia for inviting me to do this talk this evening, and very excited to be here. So some of you here today or tuning in later through the recorded version on YouTube may recognize me or my logo from my Instagram page, Wild Wetlands. So I started this Instagram page back in 2021, shortly after completing my master's. And ever since I was young, I had always admired wetlands. Growing up in rural Nova Scotia, gathering plants in wetlands such as cranberries and huckleberries. That's a photo of huckleberries at the bottom left of my screen there. Blueberries, bake apple, also having family from Newfoundland and going there every summer and experiencing the expansive bogs that are there. I've always had a special appreciation for these ecosystems. So during both my bachelor's and my master's degrees, I sought opportunities to work on wetlands related research and the ability to find ways to expand my knowledge on these ecosystems. So this has inspired a lot of interest in the plants and the animals and the insects that live in these ecosystems. And it also inspired a new hobby. I really got into photography, especially during the pandemic, because I was wrapping up my master's at the end of that and wanted something new to do. So through this Instagram, I like to share stories and information related to different aspects of wetlands, using my educational knowledge, but also things that I've learned from others. And through this Instagram page that I've created, I also get to meet other people with like-minded interests, and it's been a fun experience. So also through what I created of my Wild Wetlands Instagram page is that I hope to inspire other people to appreciate wetlands and just consider the environment in which they live and the other species that live in these environments. So after completing my bachelor's degree, I started to get very interested in conservation and environmental work, especially locally here in Nova Scotia. And I've since worked for a variety of environmental nonprofits and research groups. And so for this talk, I'll be sharing forested wetlands research that I began working on back in 2017 and that I ended up publishing in 2021. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that me and the folks from Nature Nova Scotia and many of you tuning in today are meeting here in Mi'kmaq, the unceded territory and ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So I grew up in and currently live in what's called Gesbukwit, and this means at land's end or end of flow, and that's Southwest Nova Scotia. So wetlands are important ecosystems to everyone. Wetlands are home to many culturally significant plants to the Mi'kmaq. Sweetgrass, for example, grows in areas where salt water meets fresh water. So you can think in the upper reaches of salt marshes. There's many salt marshes throughout Nova Scotia. Sweetgrass is an important medicinal plant that is used for many things such as smudging, braiding, and also used in decorative parts of baskets. So we all depend on wetlands. Wetlands provide us many different ecosystem services. They provide us food, so you can think cranberries from a bog or mussels and fish from estuaries. They also buffer against storms, and they also hold water during drought. And that's something we've seen recently with all the wildfires that have impacted a lot of our areas in Nova Scotia. And in addition, they store carbon and therefore affect our climate. And that's what we're going to get a little bit into today. So wetlands in the past, they haven't always had the greatest recognition. You may have heard of a variety of world folklore of wetland monsters, especially in swamps. Just a quick search on Google brought up some interesting imagery. If you see to the bottom left of my screen, the Wisconsin Wetlands Association shared an article about 9 wetland monsters from world folklore. So do wetlands scare you? I guess in that photo that's a little scary. Some other things, like in the past, I've often looked up swamps and what other people think of swamps, and I get something that looks like the image to the top right. So a little bit of a spooky image with trees and a lack of green vegetation. Other things in just popular culture with swamps, you get movies like Swamp Thing by DC back in 1982 of a creepy man that turns into a swamp monster. And many of you likely know about Shrek. Shrek lived in a swamp. I can understand why he wanted to live in a swamp. I love swamps and all wetlands. So wetlands they're actually beautiful ecosystems. They're not scary. They have fascinating plants. That's an image of me on the Balancing Rock Trail in Digby. And there's swamps along the path there that are home to some really, really fascinating plants. I'm admiring the skunk cabbage. So I guess I can understand why people in the past thought of these ecosystems as spooky when you have a plant called skunk cabbage that produces enough heat to melt away the snow from around the plant. It's one of the first flowering plants in Nova Scotia. And hence the name, this plant produces an aroma resembling rotting garbage, but the smell is important to attract pollinators so that it can be pollinated. So what are wetlands? I want to give a quick overview of what wetlands are, and a variety of different organizations have different definitions for what wetlands are. Depending on who you talk to, you get a slightly different definition. The gist of it is that wetlands are areas where you are in a transition between water and land. So my favorite definition is by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and their definition of a wetland is that wetlands are areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. And the Convention on Wetlands is an intergovernmental treaty that provides the framework for national action and international cooperation for the conservation and wise use of wetlands and their resources. The convention was adopted in the Iranian city of Ramsar. In Iran, there's many, many beautiful wetlands, and that's why it started there. And this convention came into force in 1975. So this definition includes freshwater marshes and salt marshes, peatlands, so your fens and bogs, shallow water, we're talking ponds, and swamps, and as well as artificial wetlands, which are constructed wetlands such as living shorelines. The living shorelines are a popular trend by a lot of organizations now in coastal communities. So in Nova Scotia, wetlands are classified based on the Canadian Wetland Classification System. Different provinces in Nova Scotia classify wetlands a little differently. And even if you're in a different country, wetlands may be classified slightly different. But here in Nova Scotia, we follow the Canadian Wetland Classification System. So one of our classes of wetlands are marshes. You have our freshwater marshes, and these are characterized by high water levels and the dominance of grasses and sedges, as you can see in my picture there. And then we also have salt marshes. The same idea, but instead of fresh water, you have salt water, and these ecosystems are influenced by the tides. And you have different grass species that are salt tolerant. And then we have bogs. A bog is a type of peatland. So a peatland is a wetland that has peat deposits of 40 centimeters depth or greater. And another type of peatland is a fen. So a fen is distinguished from a bog based on a more movement of water. So a bog, the only input of water to this ecosystem is from precipitation. It's either rain or snow. A fen may have slow moving streams through them, such as in this picture here that I have. And then we have a shallow water. So shallow water includes ponds or your lakeshore wetlands. The image here is actually a pond in my backyard that I took for this. And finally, we have swamps. So swamp is a term that's been used in Canada to refer to forested or wooded wetlands and peatlands. So a peatland can also be a swamp if it's with 40 centimeters of peat depth. But you can also have a swamp that's not a peatland and has more mineral soil. So for this talk, I'm focused on this Atlantic Forested Wetland project that I was very fortunate to be a part of. And this large collaborative project was funded by the Atlantic Ecosystems Initiative. And this project was undertaken by a diverse group of different researchers, students, and institutions across Atlantic Canada to better understand the ecology of forested wetlands. So the principal investigators of this project was Dr. Karen Harper and Dr. Cindy Stacer. And I worked closely with Karen Harper on my project. So this initiative built on previous studies initiated by different team members on structural diversity and vegetative communities, at-risk lichen species distribution and lichen communities, habitat identification for at-risk land birds, and carbon sequestration. So carbon sequestration is what I focused on. And that word sequestration refers to the ecosystem, so the plants in the ecosystem taking carbon from the atmosphere, so through their natural processes of photosynthesis, and then bringing that carbon into the ecosystem through their plants and into the soil. And there were many forested wetlands that were studied across the region. So you can see in the map that I have on the slide, all those different dots and things represent different sites that were part of the study. So a large amount that were in Nova Scotia, but some in New Brunswick, PEI, as well as Newfoundland. So out of this large collaborative research project, there were a variety of different scientific studies that were published with important findings to support the ecology and conservation of forested wetlands. So one paper that came out was by Karen Harper, Logan Gray, and Natasha Guerry on the spatial patterns of vegetation structure and structural diversity across edges between forested wetlands and upland forests in Atlantic Canada. Oh, my cat is trying to come up here, so sorry if she knocks things over. Okay, just back into my presentation. Another paper we had. Just going to minimize that. Yet the bumblebee diversity differs across forested wetlands in clear cuts in the Acadian forest by Delaney Brooks and Joseph Nacera. The importance of boreal forested wetlands for epiphytic macrolichen communities by Tegan Paget and Yolanda Wiersma, and that paper came out of Newfoundland. The relative conservation value of Nova Scotia's forests, forested wetlands as avian diversity hotspots by John Brasner and Frances McKinnon. And a very recent paper that came out just this year, actually just a couple months ago, I think. Forested wetlands in a protected area and the adjacent working landscape provide complementary biodiversity value based on breeding birds, a case study from Nova Scotia, also led by John Brasner. And finally, we have my paper that was published in 2021 on the role of temperate treed swamps as a carbon sink in southwestern Nova Scotia. So this was written by myself under the supervision of Kevin Hamden, who now is a professor at Carleton University in Ontario, and Karen Harper, who is an adjunct professor at Dal and St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, and has her own research group called Forest Edge Research Network, so FERN, and David Burton, who is a professor at the Dalhousie Agricultural College. And one other thing that came out of this project is the Atlantic Canada Forested Wetlands Project story map. So if you're into seeing things a bit more visualized, all you have to do is look up on any search engine of this story map based in ArcGIS, and you can explore the different sites that were studied and learn a little more about forested wetlands and the different aspects of the project, such as plant diversity, the land birds at risk, or forest biodiversity value. Now getting into my work, which focused on carbon and forested wetlands. So wetlands are they're well known to be important carbon stores, but there still is much research yet to be done. The wetlands sequester, that's that word sequester again, so they're bringing the carbon into the ecosystem, and store soil carbon as part of their role in the carbon cycle. And carbon is sequestered through the wetlands by the inputs of litterfall. Litterfall is the leaves coming from trees and other plants, and the below ground biomass, so the roots and rhizomes of plants, and released to the environment through outputs, which are carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and dissolved organic carbon through the groundwater, so that's DOC there. And so my paper on carbon storage in forested wetlands was the first paper to document these different inputs and outputs, allowing for determining the balance, the carbon balance of the ecosystem. And this was also one of few similar studies like this in forested wetlands globally. So there's still a lot more work to be done. So again, the type of forested wetland that we studied are called treed swamps. You can also have shrub swamps, but we focused on treed swamps where the dominance of canopy cover is trees. So the goal of my research was to quantify the carbon balance of the treed swamps in southwestern Nova Scotia. And specifically, we aimed to determine whether treed swamp soils are net carbon sink or a carbon source in relation to climate change. The objectives of the research were 1, to determine carbon input through the Litterfall, 2, assess decomposition rates and carbon stores, 3, quantify carbon equivalent output as carbon dioxide, methane, as well as nitrous oxide. And 4, compare these variables to surrounding ecosystems and sites. So comparing the wetlands to the upland forest, as well as the edge between the upland forest and the wetlands. So the study area of my paper was in Southwest Nova Scotia. And I had 3 study sites, 2 that are located in Kempt of Queens County, that are located behind the research station by the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute near McGowan Lake in what is now a protected wilderness area. So you can see the 2 stars up to the top right of the map, 1 and 2. And the 3rd site was located within GHGs National Park and Historic Site. That's number 3 star to the bottom left of the map. And that was located between GHGs Lake and Grafton Lake. So within each of those 3 sites, we chose 3 20-meter by 5-meter plots. And at each site along a transect, so that's that line on my image here going from the upland forest through the edge to the wetland. And it was at a perpendicular angle to the edge. And the edge in this image is represented by that dashed line. And the wetland at the top, you can see has smaller trees, whereas the upland is more distinguished by bigger trees. But still, looking at a satellite image, it's rather difficult to distinguish a wetland from an upland forest. And at each of these plots, I measured the litterfall, decomposition rates, and soil carbon content, as well as soil greenhouse gas emissions. And I selected each of the plots in the wetland edge and upland forest based on a similarity in species composition, the canopy cover, and the dominant tree height. So the first of my methods for quantifying the carbon inputs and outputs was collecting the litterfall. The litterfall represents both the broadleaves and the needle leaves from trees and shrubs, as well as ferns, that fall naturally throughout the growing season. So in each of the plots in the wetland edge and upland forest, I had placed 4 garden trays, as you can see in the left image there. And in each of these trays, I just had plastic mesh and just collected the litterfall as it naturally fell. And I collected the litterfall monthly throughout spring and summer, and bi-weekly during autumn because you have a lot of litterfall in autumn. And I collected right until the end of December. There was no collection during the winter because there's very little litterfall. And from this litterfall that I had collected, I air dried it, as you can see in the image to the right, laid it out, air dried it, and then I dried it in an oven to remove all the moisture to be able to get the full litterfall weight. And then I analyzed those samples for the total carbon and nitrogen. So the next method that I used for quantifying and understanding the carbon inputs and outputs and dynamics in the soil was measuring decomposition. And there's a few different ways to scientifically measure decomposition, but we chose a method that's been used by a few different researchers and that can be easily replicated by anyone. So decomposition is the process of organic materials breaking down over time. So just like compost for your garden. And they're broken down by microbes that utilize the carbon and nutrients in the organic material, and therefore putting it back into the soil or releasing gases back to the atmosphere as a byproduct of decomposition. So a greater decomposition may mean more emissions to the atmosphere and more carbon being used by those microbes, whereas a slower decomposition may mean less emissions. So we use tea bags to measure the decay rate of plant material over time by following what's called the tea bag index procedure. And the method of this was burying tea bags in pairs, one green tea and one rooibos tea, and they had to be Lipton green tea to follow the method because each tea bag has different weights. And they were buried in May and recovered in September. And what I did with these tea bags that I collected, I used the initial weight before burial and the final oven dry weight to measure the mass loss over the burial period and to determine the decomposition rate of the soil. And what's interesting about this method is that it can be done by anyone just at home. All you need are these tea bags, some way of being able to label the tea bags to identify them later, and a familiarity with using Microsoft Excel, because you have to do a few calculations to get your results. So assessing the carbon storage, we had to collect soil samples because carbon is stored in the soils of wetlands. So I collected 3 organic soil samples from the wetlands and edges, and they were collected using soil cores. So you can see in the 2 images to the right, you just take I think I was using a PVC pipes and getting it into the soil, and that way it's a minimal disturbance of the ecosystem and you're able to collect the sample that you need. So the wetland soils were predominantly organic material. At the edge, there was a small amount of mineral soil at the bottom, which is the image to the far right. There's a little bit of gray mineral soil at the bottom. So for collecting organic material from the upland, I used more of a simple method to collect the forest floor by using a shovel and collecting a small square. And then where that organic soil was collected, the image to the left there is the example of the forest floor that I had collected using a shovel. Beneath that, I collected the mineral soil using a bulk density core. And this is a metal rod with a metal circular thing that drops down and collects an intact mineral soil sample. And so from these samples, I measured the moisture content and the bulk density by oven drying. And as well, I measured the pH and organic content. Organic content I measured using a method called loss on ignition. And this is just burning the soil to a really high temperature where you're just left with what's called the ash content, and that's your mineral soil. So you're able to differentiate your organic from your non-organic. And from these samples, I also analyzed the total carbon and the total nitrogen. And my last method that I used was assessing the greenhouse gases that come from the soil. And I measured the greenhouse gases using a method called a non-steady state vented chamber technique. And this is following the soil greenhouse gas flux measurement toolkit. That's that image to the left there. This is a method that was developed by the folks at the Dalhousie University Agricultural Campus. And what I did was installed 4 PVC pipe collars. You can see me hammering that in that picture to the right. And that's just putting that into the soil. And then you put this chamber on top of it, as you can see in the diagram on that report there. And when the chamber is put on top of the collar, the gas accumulates in it, and then you extract the gas samples over a 30-minute period. And then these gas samples are analyzed on a machine called a gas chromatograph, which allows me to determine the exact concentrations in the gas samples of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These 3 gases are 3 of the most important greenhouse gases. And also note that I measured these gas samples on the same day every week from May to August. Right, a lot of samples to analyze. So what I learned from all of these different measurements that I looked at is that the forested wetlands were found to represent large supplies of carbon input via litterfall from the forest cover. There were some interesting things that I found that I was not expecting. So for example, it was surprising that the wetlands actually lost more litter mass over time as part of the teabag index that I used to assess the decomposition than the uplands. And that's surprising because wetlands are expected to have a slower decomposition rate. But these findings of that may be explained by similar environmental conditions among the upland forest and the forested wetland, such as soil pH and temperature were very similar. What I did find that was very different is the carbon that is stored among these different sites. So the stores of organic carbon in soils result from the balance between the inputs and the outputs of carbon over a relatively long period of time. And I found that there was substantially more carbon stored in the wetland soils than those in the upland forest and the edge, which is in agreement with other studies of wetlands. And so the wetland soils had around 4.1 times more total carbon, and I see I have a spelling mistake there, but it's carbon, than the upland forests. So wetlands have around 31,000 grams per meter squared of carbon compared to the edge and upland forests that have only around 7,000. That's a lot more. Now I made these graphs to help explain some correlations that I had found among the temperature of the soil and the moisture of the soil. So on the graph to the left shows soil temperature, and the graph on the right shows soil moisture. So the blue triangles on both graphs represent carbon as carbon dioxide and methane combined, and the red diamonds represent either temperature or moisture. So looking at the temperature graph to the left, there is a correlation that with increasing temperatures, so the red diamonds, that carbon dioxide and methane also increase. And looking at the graph to the right of soil moisture, there's a correlation that with decreasing moisture, carbon dioxide and methane increase. And the highest methane emission that was recorded was in late July when there was higher temperature and lower moisture. And I've circled those data points on both of the graphs in green. So just to follow up with those graphs that I just shared, the highest greenhouse gas carbon emissions from the wetlands occurred during the summer when the soil temperatures were the highest and the soils were the driest. So the stronger correlation between moisture and carbon emissions also may indicate that although temperature has an effect on the carbon emitted from the wetlands, the hydrology may be more important. So the hydrology is the water levels. And when we're talking about forested wetlands and your treed swamps, they have a variable water table. And that's something that makes it hard to differentiate forested wetlands from forests. If you're out walking in the woods and you're in a forested wetland and it's a dry summer, you may not even know you're in a forested wetland until you look at the plant species that are growing there, because the water table can drop significantly in the summer when it's dry, but be very wet in the spring and the winter. So now, although I did find carbon dioxide and methane to represent net carbon emissions in the forested wetlands, the carbon outputs were very small in comparison to the carbon inputs through the Litterfall. And now methane emissions were similar to rates reported by another study in the Kejimkujik area, but CO2 was greater than that reported by that same study. And that study by Clare and others back in 2002, they predicted that the Kejimkujik area may be converted from a passive carbon storage to active source of greenhouse gases. I included this diagram here just to help explain a little bit where these methanes and carbon dioxides are coming from. So in the bottom of your wetland, you have your wetland soil, also called peat. And the bottom layer has anaerobic decomposition. And anaerobic decomposition refers to decomposition absent of oxygen. So you have more methane coming from that. And with aerobic decomposition at the top, it has oxygen, so it's more aerated. So you'll have more carbon dioxide. And then you have carbon dioxide coming into the ecosystem through your photosynthesis of the plants. So the plants taking in carbon dioxide as their food source. To give a little summary of these inputs and outputs, we have large carbon inputs through the Litterfall coming into the wetland at 154 grams per meter squared, compared to 46 grams per meter square leaving the wetland as carbon emissions. So this means that these forested wetland ecosystems represent a carbon sink. They have more carbon coming in than carbon leaving. So that same paper that I mentioned on the previous slides by Clare and others in 2002, they predicted that there would be a doubling of greenhouse gas emissions from wetlands in the Kejimkujik area due to climate change. So I doubled the output emissions of 46 grams per meter squared, and doubling it brought it up to 92 grams per meter squared. And that number is still less than the carbon inputs through Litterfall. So despite a changing climate, forested wetlands have the potential to still be able to maintain their role as a carbon sink because of their large carbon inputs from the Litterfall. So to wrap up and conclude what I was explaining between the carbon inputs and the carbon outputs, is that these unique ecosystems of forested wetlands are able to maintain their ecological role as a carbon sink, despite a scenario of doubling greenhouse gas emissions due to changes in climate. So this is something that distinguishes forested wetlands from other types of wetlands, such as the marshes that don't have trees, or open bogs that also don't have trees. And as well, this supports conservation efforts that aim to preserve such ecosystems as a measure to mitigate climate change. And I threw this photo in here that I took of a common plant that grows in a lot of swamps here in Nova Scotia. Swamp milkweed. It's a native plant that grows in riverside swamps. So now, since completing my research and publishing it, I've noticed other papers on forested wetlands being published unrelated to this Atlantic Canada forested wetlands project. So there was one paper that came out of China just this year on organic carbon releases from litter decomposition of woody and herbaceous plants. And my paper was sourced in it. So that was pretty exciting to see my paper being sourced in a paper from another country. There was another paper on the long-term carbon accumulation in temperate swamp soils, a case study from a swamp in Ontario. So again, my paper was cited in that paper as well. And then there was a great review on swamps and the unrecognized importance of carbon stocks and fluxes from swamps in Canada and the US. And my paper again was sourced in that. And I think it was the only one from Nova Scotia in it. So that's very exciting to see more research being done on forested wetlands and the carbon storage. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining me today, or for those that are watching the recorded YouTube version later. And thank you to Nature Nova Scotia for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to share the importance of wetlands and their carbon storage. So now I encourage all of you listening in to read more about wetlands, or look for other learning opportunities such as this. I know that Nature Nova Scotia hosts regular monthly meetings on a variety of different environmental topics in Nova Scotia. Or I also encourage you to visit a wetland near you, wherever you may live. There are many easily accessible wetlands. If you're in Nova Scotia, if you're in the Annapolis Valley, which is where I live, there's the Miners Marsh in Kentville. There's the French Basin Trail in Annapolis Royal. And there's also the Old Mill Trail near Greenwood, which is a wheelchair accessible park that takes you along the swamps of the Annapolis River. And even in Halifax, if you're in the city, there are urban wetlands that you can visit, such as Belcher's Marsh, that is there. It's thriving despite being surrounded by apartment buildings and subdivisions. And if you're on Instagram, you can find me on my page, Wild Wetlands, and I post regularly a variety of wetland sites that you can visit. And as you can see in this slide that I put a few photos. The left image is eastern white cedar in a cedar swamp here in Nova Scotia. That's a relatively rare swamp here, but in other provinces such as New Brunswick, the white cedar is quite common along the St. John River system. The image in the middle is the skunk cabbage in the swamps along the Balancing Rock Trail in Digby County. That's a really easily accessible trail that you can admire the swamps and the fascinating plants within them. Another example of a trail through swamps is at Kejimkujik National Park. That trail goes through the swamps along the river floodplains. And my final slide. Again, if you're interested in learning more about wetlands, I included my Instagram tag at Wild Wetlands. As well, I'm also on Twitter at Wild Wetlands NS. And if you'd like to read my paper, you can find it on ResearchGate. The title is The Role of Temperate Treed Swamps as a Carbon Sink in Southwest Nova Scotia. So if you want to learn a little more about how I calculated those numbers that I presented, or check out some more of the statistics and the methodology, you can find it on ResearchGate. And I just want to add again that this study was one of few assessing the carbon storage in forested wetlands, and the only one in Nova Scotia. So for future work, I do recommend this study being replicated in other wetlands in Nova Scotia, or expanding on my work to include other aspects of carbon inputs and outputs. So for example, looking at the dynamics of carbon storage in relation to microbial activity, or looking at the dissolved organic carbon export. I do have some preliminary data on that, so thought I'd share that if anyone's interested in exploring this further. Replication of studies is very important to further verify the importance of carbon storage in wetlands. And I just end this note with a photo of the beautiful Lehigh River floodplain red maple swamp.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel.
You're welcome.
I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything, but yeah, that was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
I guess like I have a quick question. I always have questions. Obviously, like with the recent wildfires in Nova Scotia, like what kind of role would a forested wetland play in that and like mitigating it potentially?
That's a great question, and it's actually something that's come across from many people asking what are the roles of wetlands in relation to the wildfires. So forested wetlands or other larger wetlands, I really want to shout out some of the marshes and the big bogs that have higher water tables, that if they are healthy and undisturbed, they naturally can act as a retardant to wildfires because of their high water tables, and plants such as sphagnum mosses that naturally have high water content. However, when we're in a period of extreme drought with climate change and when wetlands are disturbed, they aren't able to work to their full capacity. Over the weekend, I was down in the Shelburne area hiking, and I did go check one of the bogs called Swain's Bog. It's a protected ecosystem. I can report that it was safe, but I was walking along and I could see at the edge of the wetlands, the forest fire ended at the edge of a lot of the wetlands, but there were some other wetlands that they were far drier than usual with the dry spring that we had that unfortunately did burn a little bit.
Hmm.
So that's one thing that it's so important to protect, preserve, and restore wetlands so that they're able to work to their full capacity or in periods of drought and wildfires.
Yeah, I'll have to tell the director Becky about that because she was planning an event down there.
Oh, really? Well, it's fine. The sundews, the rare sundews are okay.
Perfect. Okay, I'll let her know. We have a couple questions coming in. So the first one, if you had to pick one wetland to visit within Nova Scotia, which one would you recommend?
Oh my, there are so many wetlands. There are so many beautiful wetlands. Oh gosh, what would I recommend? That's a really tough question to narrow down on just one wetland. My all-time favorite wetland is the one that I just mentioned, the Swain's Bog in Shelburne County. It's absolutely beautiful with the rare plants that are in it. But in terms of swamps, if you're ever in the Kejimkujik areas, there's a lot of gorgeous swamps. And actually, as I'm looking at the swamp photo in front of me on the slide, if you're near Bridgewater, the Rails to Trails goes along the Lehigh River, and it takes you through some gorgeous red maple swamps. And if you walk there in the fall, when the maples are all red, it's beautiful.
The next question, Misa's wondering, carbon input, is that referring to CO2 taken in by plants through photosynthesis? Or
Yes, yeah. So I'll clarify that one. With the carbon input, that's what we were measuring it was through the Litterfall. So when you have a plant, the plant takes in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then the plant its leaves die, and then that carbon is in the plant, and then it falls into the soil, and then it ends up into the soil. I hope that clarified that a little bit.
John is wondering, you have pictures of wetlands over a relatively short period. Do you have any information on how the carbon input/output has changed over the last 50 plus years?
So I don't have information on that, and that's one of the issues with there being relatively little studies, and my paper being one of the first ones. But there were other studies in the past, in early 2000s and the 90s, that did assess the carbon inputs and outputs, but not all the different aspects in one paper. So you might be able to find one paper just assessing carbon dioxide, one paper just assessing methane, or one paper just assessing dissolved organic carbon. So that actually could be a really interesting study to compile all those papers and put them in a type of a review to have a better idea of how that has changed over the years. So I don't have an answer for that, but that's certainly something that can be figured out. And that's also something that why it would be really great to expand on what I've done and build onto it and look at it into other ecosystems, or even the same ecosystem, so that 50 years in the future, then we can have that answer.
John is also wondering how invasive species have affected wetlands in Nova Scotia.
Not really a good effect. The issue with invasive species is that they take over and they choke out other plants. And if you have, let's say, a wetland where one invasive species gets in there, so one I can think of, actually two I can think of that are really bad, are your invasive Japanese knotweed or your invasive Phragmites. It's that really tall reeds. Unfortunately, I've seen it growing at the French Basin Trail in Annapolis Royal. When you have just the one plant, you have the dominance of one plant, it kills the other things, and you don't have dynamics of plants being able to absorb different rates of carbon dioxide into the soil. You just have one thing. And it also reduces biodiversity. It's not very good.
Yeah. So definitely not positive.
Not positive. If there's I don't know, invasives are bad. There's not a positive angle for the most part. But there are plants that have been introduced and they're not necessarily invasive. They become naturalized. So those aren't bad, but it's the ones that have the invasive tendencies.
I also thought it was like it's interesting that you think there could be like a literature review or like a overall review of wetlands in general in Nova Scotia. I think that would also be a really great project. But
yeah, and actually I want to highlight, I had it back in a previous slide. I can go back. Nope, it's not letting me go back. Oh, there it is. Okay, so on here, that paper here called The Unrecognized Importance of Carbon Stocks and Fluxes, that is a review paper. It doesn't focus on Nova Scotia, but it focuses on Canada and the USA. So that's an interesting paper, and I recommend looking it up.
Yeah, that looks like a good read. It looks like there's no more questions, so do you have any like final notes that you want to?
I don't really have my final note was just consider the wetlands around you and take time to appreciate them. They're everywhere. There's from just the smallest little pond in the woods to the big salt marshes of the Bay of Fundy. Like they're everywhere. And just think about it if you're out for a drive or out for a walk, or even if you're watching TV and they're in the background, they're everywhere.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to everybody who came out. Yeah, I'll be posting this on YouTube later. I hope you all have a good night.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.